philosophers in space.
Welcome back to Philosophers in Space, my friends. I am Captain Callie Wright, joined as always by my Chief Ethics Officer, Aaron Rabinowitz. Aaron, what's going on, friend?
Captain, I'm excited to be back in the Trekverse with you. I even wrote you a little song just for this specific occasion.
Oh my god, I am so excited for this.
You ready? This is a callback for us to all the old listeners, and that's just pretty much all the listeners at this point. Mushroom, ripper, mushroom. Tardigrade, he's a tardigrade!
So, dear listener, it is a fact that Aaron and I go out of our way to not do bits that we plan super far ahead of time. So it is very genuine that during this recording is the first time I have heard that. Aaron teased me with, he's like, I got a thing. I don't know how it's going to go. It was brilliant.
The cherry on top of that reference is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year.
Okay. Well, with that, I am done recording. I'm leaving.
Those little baby badgers can drink next year. It's all right. We'll just bleep that one. It was good. It was worth it.
Sorry. Sorry, Lou.
It's okay. You're not the only one who just cursed at me. It's fine.
I have, yeah. Well, and this is the thing, right? I feel like with every episode, I end up having some new version of an existential crisis. Sometimes it's very, very deep. Like, what's the nature of sentience? And am I even conscious? And then some of it are like, you remember that meme that was like super fundamental to your childhood? It can drink alcohol next year. Like, life ruiner.
On the plus side, giant tardigrade.
Right. Giant tardigrade that
trade-offs, you know. You can take the good with the bad here.
Which I guess we'll get into. And it's not even really enough to talk about as a plot highlight, but just the moment where Landry is like, did it just shush you? Like right before it like totally kicks off with the big fight and everything. God, so good.
Yeah.
So good. So puppy hangouts.
We have at this point started our puppy hangouts. By the time y'all are hearing this, we will have already done at least one. We probably will not have done a second one yet because we will have been off. I will have been off at AACon. You are not, sadly. But we will be doing more of those, and we're excited about it. And we're also excited about various NASAs and things. We've got a fun special NASA for April, so you'll be looking forward to that. Yeah, lots going on. Lots of good times.
Yeah, and if you'll remember, I just made the fact known that if we didn't get there, Wedge would be sad, right? So we did get there, and I got to deliver the good news to Wedge, and I'm just pleased as punch to report that he was very excited and very happy. He absolutely understood what was happening.
Totally.
And he's very excited about it. So
Yep. Also totally understood. Will be passed out on the bed in a very cute way that everyone can enjoy.
Wonderful. Well, it might be time to go ahead and plot me.
There's plenty to discover anyway, right?
So this week we were talking about the wonderful episode of Star Trek Discovery, Context is for Kings, and Aaron is going to teach us a little bit about mushroom philosophy. That's my understanding of what it's going to be.
We tease this as Context is for Kings. I should really say we're probably really covering like the first. It's actually the third and fourth episodes of the show, because this show, I actually will say, I think Discovery may be my favorite start out. At the beginning Star Trek. I think we can all agree that Star Trek shows are notoriously challenging in their first seasons. But I loved Discovery from the get-go. A lot of things people hated about it, I loved. I loved the Klingons. I was happy that it was really dark. Almost every choice that was made, I was really on board with. And then they got to the mushrooms. And I was so sold. And they hadn't even gotten to the super queer parts yet. And I was already completely 100% on board with this Trek. But yeah, we're going to cover the early part and primarily how the ship is special kind of thing is going to be the main focus here, let's say.
Yeah, absolute same. I got together and watched the premiere as it aired with a group of Klingon fans specifically, because we had known that Klingons were going to be the big bads and that they had actually hired translators to do the translation, and the actors had dialogue coaches. And so we were all very excited that there was going to be like quality Klingon, because Star Trek trivia with Callie moment, a lot of people don't know this, but the Klingon language that you hear in TNG, DS9, Voyager, and some of Enterprise is completely wrong. Like, it's
Wait, back up. Well, there's a real language and they're doing it poorly, is what you're saying.
yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. It's so imagine you're trying to learn a language, like a real Earth language, and you have a dictionary for that language, and you just like go to the back where the word dictionary is, and you put those words together as if the grammar is the same as English.
This is how I failed 6 years of Latin, actually. I actually know exactly what you're describing.
That is largely the Klingon that you hear in like 90s, early 2000s Trek, is people doing that and paying zero attention to how it's supposed to be pronounced. Like, everybody says kapla, and that is the super, super lazy. Like, it is kapla.
Okay, all right. We're gonna put a giant pointy Klingon pin in this, and I think this will be something that I'm just gonna let you loose after dark, and you can just go full Klingon. Because I'm glad that they're bringing that kind of culturally relevant, standpoint stuff to this, and actually doing the indigenous languages properly. So I'm excited to hear more about that. But it isn't like the main focus, I suppose, of our current discussion.
It is the main focus of my discussion for sure. I'm going rogue.
Do you want to at least explain what the Klingons are up to at the beginning of this that like starts our story ball rolling here?
Yeah, and it's interesting the way they do the story in the first season of Discovery, which I also really, really enjoyed. The first 2 episodes are kind of like prequels, and it feels like the first season really doesn't start until this episode. And so we meet Burnham, we meet Georgiou, we see the Shenzhou, an old ship that they're both on, and they run into this mysterious presence on the edge of Federation space. There's like a probe that's been damaged, and they run into the and they run into the Klingon sarcophagus ship. And in Klingon politics, what's happening now is that like the great houses are warring with one another, and they're basically as one does.
Pretty much just Klingon politics right there.
Yeah, and they're essentially like calling out for Klingon Jesus. Who is Takuvma, who is supposed to be the one to unite the great houses, and they're gonna fight the good fight. And the central conflict is that like Michael Burnham thinks she knows how to deal with the Klingons, which, by the way, she's correct, because Michael Burnham is always right. That is number one rule of Discovery: is Michael Burnham is always almost always
she has
eventually right.
Another Vulcan in her head.
Right. It's
a bit of an edge.
Yeah. And so that's like the first 2 episodes are kind of that story playing out. And that's like kind of set dressing for the real plot of the first season, which leads Michael Burnham to USS Discovery under Captain Gabriel Lorca, who is just, God, he is one of the best characters in Star Trek. He's so good.
He is really entertaining, and it's a funny name in particular because there are sort of references to Lorca in like weird beat fiction poetry stuff. Anyway, there's the writer Lorca. My experience when I rewatched this actually is it really feels like some of similar to, I think, Farpoint, right? That's the one in the original Next Gen where it's like you have this like premiere, right. The premiere is this kind of 2-parter story, and then you get off and running into the serial version of things, and this felt very much like that as well. Like that, those first 2 episodes are like, here's a made-for-TV movie that like gets us rolling, because also like the vibe is somewhat different. I feel like a little bit.
Oh yeah.
The mood picks up a little bit, at least on the Discovery ship, as opposed to beforehand, where it's just relentlessly dark for those first 2 episodes.
Well, yeah, because at the beginning, the Shenzhou feels very much like this is. I don't want to say your everyday average, because you get the sense that Georgiou is like kind of a legend, or at least like her crew thinks that she is. I don't know that we get specifics about how she is viewed throughout Starfleet, but her crew like especially looks up to, loves, and respects her, Michael Burnham especially. And at the very beginning, they're on this pretty pretty standard type mission where they're like trying to figure out what's going on this planet or whatever. And that's
basic
like
save a species without them knowing situation, you know, like you do.
Yeah, that's we had the Prime Directive discussion before.
Yeah, they're not calling it that yet at this point, right? We're still calling it the like strong suggestion, I think, or something.
No. They have the Prime Directive in Discovery. It's in Enterprise when they don't have it yet.
Oh, or was I thinking? Yeah, okay. One of them was. Yeah, they call it something.
I'm pretty sure that's right. Maybe I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Okay. Odds are always better than I'm wrong about whatever we're discussing in the Star Trek. So just carry on.
Yeah. But like when you get to Discovery, like they're hinting very, very heavily that like something is happening. Right. And it even starts like the episode starts Michael Burnham in a yellow jumpsuit in irons with two other people. And they're just like talking or whatever. Cause like the one person on the shuttle doesn't realize that this is Michael Burnham, the mutineer. Right. Because Michael Burnham lands herself a life sentence in prison because she mutinied against Captain Georgiou and got her killed. And so that's
arguably she gets herself killed after not letting them shoot first, right?
Well, okay.
Like,
yeah, that's fair.
If she'd just done what she'd said and just shot the Klingons, that would have actually worked out better.
Right, again, because Michael Burnham was right.
Always right.
That's just tattoo it on my forehead. Michael Burnham was right.
Right.
And so it even starts in like they're in the prison shuttle. They're doing this like dialogue. The Klingon War has been going on. 8,000 people plus are dead. And these bugs are on the outside of the shuttle. The pilot goes out to clean them off. There's like a thing and the pilot flies off and it's like, oh crap, like we're all on our own. And then all of the sudden there's a tractor beam and there's USS Discovery, which is, I love the design of Discovery. Like, she is a rugged beauty for sure, but she is gorgeous, and gets even more so later on when they go forward and she gets the refit. Love that ship. Love.
I assume there's going to be an accept at the end of this, though, right? Like,
no.
I think we can say it's an amazing ship right up until the decision they made for how to convey its special travel.
Oh. Oh, do you mean the
flippy flip? Yeah, the flippy flop. Yeah.
No, I actually enjoy the flippy flop as well.
The spin, the portal, like the giant ship turns over like a pancake. That does it for you.
I like it.
Okay.
This
hey.
So this is
no, it's fine. It's fine. You want to explain the giant pancake to folks?
Yes.
Tell them about the pancake.
So. We get a little bit more like set dressing. We'll get more into this in After Dark, but I have a crush on everyone in
everyone in this entire show. Literally everyone.
We'll talk more about that in the After Dark. That's most of what I'm going to talk about in the
Even
After
Doug
Dark,
Jones,
to be fair.
Especially Doug Jones.
Have you seen the way he walks?
Come on. As long as he keeps the suit on. The one episode where he doesn't have the suit, really weird.
Right. And so like we get to Discovery and we realize that some of the Shenzhou's crew is now on Discovery. So Kayla Detmer was injured very, very badly and has like cybernetic implants, and she's on the bridge. Saru, who was the science officer on the Shenzhou, is now the first officer on Discovery, and they're all like, "You got Georgiou killed. You almost got me killed." And so there's these like awkward moments where they're interacting with each other. And when Michael goes to her quarters, this is where we meet Sylvia Tilly, my sweet, darling Sylvia Tilly, my sweet little neurodivergent, anxious baby. I love her so much.
If Sylvia Tilly were our only queer neurodivergent engineer on this show, it would have been enough. But
correct.
Thankfully,
absolutely correct.
She's not even... There are so many. It's just all. It's just all. It's all.
Yeah. Very great. And the first real like something weird thing is happening going. That's the first time that we hear Black Alert.
Oh right, yeah.
And there's the like really weird alarm sound. Gravity gets weird for a minute, and Burnham's like, "What's going on?" And Tilly's like, "You weren't briefed?" Well, then I can't tell you. And she's like very nervous about what's going on, and she like turns over and like tucks herself into her bed when they do it. and like you still kind of just don't know what's happening, and like they keep signaling over and over again like something weird's happening here. I think this is also where we get the black Section 31 comm badges, which is like very funny for a unit that no one is supposed to know exists. You get your own badges.
Gotta have a special badge, obviously.
Interesting
decision. You also get the
decision.
floating goo, which is a nice effect.
Yes. Yeah. That's the weird gravity thing. It's you see the floating. That's very fun. And we still don't really know what's going on. And Burnham kind of just gets assigned to a shift in engineering, where you learn a little bit more about the weird stuff that's happening. Tilly has a very fun moment where she's like, oh, it's like, sorry, you can't stand here. We have assigned seats. And like 30 seconds later, Stamets is like, what does he say? He says something very funny. Like,
he says, go over there somewhere. It's not like we have assigned seats, I think.
Yeah. Well, he's like, go do something away from me. Like,
right.
And it's not like we have assigned seats. And Tilly does the very defending herself, like, listen, I said that because I don't want people to think that we're friends because you're a bad person and I can't be seen associating with you. I don't really have moments like that anymore, but before I had developed social skills, like that's 100% a thing that I would do. Like, I just have to call attention to the weird thing in the room and make excuses for it and apologize and very sorry all the time. And
no, every dialogue scene in the engineering room is amazing, even before they all get high. It's such a wonderful cast. Anthony Rapp is so funny. And the way they roll out his relationship with Wilson Cruz, like, little spoilers, but like, I think you could pick it up pretty quickly, but also the way they reveal it is one of the best pieces of Trek, like anything ever. It's just such a great moment. And this is like, again, only a couple episodes in, you're like already have so much depth, I think, like built into these characters.
Yeah, and this is like we just passed it a little bit, but we don't have to belabor it. But I feel the need, like when Saru is leading Burnham into engineering, and he's like, "I intend to do a better job protecting my captain than you did yours."
Yeah, it's a good line. And Doug really hands it
knife into stomach line ever. Like,
I love Saru so much. And one of the cool things about Saru that we haven't talked about, Saru comes from a prey species. So they come from a planet where it's all predator or prey species. And they have a prey fear reaction that literally is like their little gills come out of the back of their neck. And this becomes like an actual important plot point at various things. It's sort of like Sting and Lord of the Rings. Like Saru glows when there's something dangerous nearby, essentially.
Yeah, he's got his threat ganglia that stand up on his neck.
I love it. It's so good.
And that's like one of the dramatic moments. Like, my species. I don't remember the exact line, but it's like, we sense the coming of death. I sense it coming now. Like right before they're about to fight the Klingons, and it's like, he doesn't go into detail, but he basically does say that like my species literally exists to be food for another species, and at this point, I don't even think that we had gotten the sense that he had left that entire thing behind. Just that, like, he was here in Starfleet and not living with his people, which we do learn more about that later, which highly, highly recommended.
Yeah, it's sort of weird because we get the impression that Saru still has those kind of prey fear reactions, but also is in this leadership position, and it kind of involves sort of overcoming those fear reactions, but also trading on them or like using them in interesting ways. And part of the reason I brought it up is because Michael Burnham uses it as a funny kind of trick in relation to our friend, the main character, the one we really want to talk about here in the intro, our dear sweet Ripper. So do you want to explain how they find Ripper and how that ties into all this stuff?
Yes. So we get a fun little vignette where Stamets is talking to someone, we don't know who. Later we find out he is the chief engineer on the USS Glenn, and they're discussing whatever project it is that they're working on. The Glenn had made some advance that Discovery had not. And I actually at first thought that Stamets was talking to his husband, because I don't think it was clear that that Wilson Cruz was the figure, or at least I didn't know that. So I was like, oh, is that his boo? Are they? Because he says something like, oh, we made it out past whatever, and he was like, I hate you, and he says it in
no, yeah, it's a good fake out. I can see what
I'm allowed to say this. He says it in a very gay way.
He does.
Like,
for sure.
I hate you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is very catty. It's very, the voice.
Yeah. And so they later on find, after Burnham demonstrates just exactly what a genius she is, uses Sylvia Tilly drool to sneak into the engineering thing and sees fungi hanging out. Doesn't really know what it's for. They figure out that the Glen, there's been a disaster aboard the Glen. They've lost communication and they need to go check it out. And they get on a shuttlecraft, and we learn a little bit more about what an absolute jerk Stamets is at the moment, or at least how very angry he is. There's a very, it's a very interesting line, because I love it when Star Trek is not afraid to critique Starfleet. And this is like kind of a thing that I wanted to like really, anytime that happens, that's probably going to be my favorite part of the episode.
Right.
He gives this really brilliant speech about how his buddy on the Glen and he had done this really interesting and important science, and they were trying to figure out like basic stuff about how the universe works, like the real Starfleet Federation mission, just like figuring out how the universe works. And then and he's kind of accusatory at like, and then you started this war, and then Starfleet was like, we're going to take your science and we're going to do what we want with it. And he is very, very angry about it, and is now
it's very
like
Manhattan
facing the
Project vibe, kind of.
Right. Yeah. And is now like facing the prospect that his best friend might be dead. And they note that there are these like weird torsion stresses on the ship. They get inside and they see people twisted and mangled in like really, really gross and disgusting ways. And some of the people,
very, very gross for Star Trek. Let's be clear. Like Star Trek usually is like, like a PG-13. This was like, Stargate Universe turn into darkness kind of vibe, which I liked. Again, I'm here for it.
Yep. And we still don't really know what's happening. We don't actually find out what's happening until the end of the episode when Lorca finally says it. But it's, we're here looking for the MacGuffin, right? Like we're trying to retrieve the thing from the ship that's like we've seen that episode of TV done a bunch of times. And the Glen is the sister ship for Discovery. And so the layout is largely the same. So they go to engineering, and it's the Discovery engineering set, but like slightly dressed a little differently.
Dark world.
And and they're like, talking through, trying to figure out what's going on. And they get attacked by this thing. They know not what. And some of the mangled people, by the way, are Klingons. We have figured out.
Right. There's a bunch of dead Klingons on the ship too. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're in the hallway, they run into a Klingon who is not dead. And you see the Klingon do the mouth, the finger to mouth thing. And this is when Landry has the great line, "Is he shushing you?"
So good.
which I laughed out loud. And then the Klingon gets grabbed from behind by something.
Yep.
And
Standard.
Of course. Very, very typical
clever girl.
type
Yep.
stuff. Yeah.
Basic.
And of course, a couple of the unnamed Marines die, that sort of thing. And they do the chase scene through the ship, and we get if memory serves, we get various pictures of what this thing looks like. We still don't know what it is, but we know it's very large, very dangerous, and very angry.
Yeah. And well designed. I think it just looks very cool every time you see it, pretty much.
Yeah. And they're running through the ship, and they're in engineering, and Burnham's like, "Give me a gun," and Landry's like, "Mutineers don't get guns. Like, that's a silly thing. I am certainly not going to give you a gun." And it's like, and because Burnham is smart, she's like, "No, I'm not trying to kill it. I'm trying to make it mad to distract it so we can all get the hell out of here." Right. And so it's successful, and she gets it to chase her down this Jeffries tube thing where she's reciting Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, yeah.
which is very interesting. And she's made a couple of oblique references to Spock. So we know from previous episodes as well, but we know that she is Spock's sister, and we know that she'd not been talked about before. That was something that people on Twitter were very upset about.
Half sister, right?
Yeah.
Obviously.
And that's one of the funny Stamets being a jerk line is when she shows up, Stamets is like, "Oh, I thought you'd be Vulcan," and he's like, and she's like, "Well, my half brother is, and I grew up on Vulcan." And
I think the point is that there's clearly no black Vulcans, obviously. Clear implications there.
That apparently was a very vicious message board argument when Tuvok was cast in Voyager. There can't be black Vulcans. Like people legitimately were angry about that on the message boards in like 1994 or whenever that was.
Of course they were. Because Vulcans are elves and like you can't have black elves. So obviously you can't have black space elves.
Right.
It's basic logic.
Yeah, and Stamets says something like my uncle Everett plays in a Beatles cover band. That doesn't mean he's John Lennon.
Right.
Very, very funny line.
Yeah, and there's another like dialogue that happens, I think, in that same shuttle ride. All the good dialogue happens in shuttle rides, obviously. And that's also, I think, where he gives her shit about like not understanding that at the basic like foundational level of the universe, there's no difference between like living and non-living, right? Because she's like figuring out the spore drive. And
basically she's like, is it physics or chemistry? And he's like, that's a dumb question.
Right. You're a dumb person who thinks dumb things. Why would you ask a dumb question?
Right.
Yeah, and then lectures her in a way that like is dumb in a way that we'll talk about, obviously. But like is a very standard, like trope of, it's very much the Watchmen, at an atomic level. There's no difference between a living body and a dead body or something like that.
Right.
Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there so we could get back to it later. But yeah, so do you want to talk about Ripper then?
Yeah. So and they get back to the ship. And eventually they capture, they end up calling it Ripper, and it's a space tardigrade. And we still don't, I still don't think we find out exactly what its connection is to the spore drive. But
not in this particular episode. We learn a lot more in the next episode, which is my fault. I apologize.
Yeah. Get it together.
God. I looked up on Memory Alpha when was the first episode with it, and I forgot that it was going to be like this tiny sort of early appearance as opposed to like the one about him. Anyway,
right. And so we get
assume the gender of the tardigrade. That's inappropriate.
Right. Get it together. I thought you were better than this. And so
are they even sexually dimorphic?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually know. That's bad podcasting on our part.
I know nothing about the reproductive habits of tardigrades, which is clearly going to make After Dark a lot less interesting.
Oh, wow. That kind of broke me. Okay. So that's kind of the end of Act 2. Burnham opens a hatch, drops into the shuttle in just the most badass way because that's who she is. And then they leave the Glen. They get back on Discovery, and the next scene is Burnham back in her like prison jumpsuit, and she enters the bridge, and they kind of start hinting that like they kind of wish that she would stick around, and she goes into the ready room, and Lorca gives her the hard sell, like, we want you on Discovery. And of course, like, Burnham has figured out, like, she's like, okay, wait, like, none of this was an accident. Like, you wanted me from the beginning. This whole thing was planned. Like, what is going on? And she is still, like, she doesn't know like what the mushrooms are about. She doesn't know what Ripper is about. She doesn't know what happened on the Glen. The closest thing that we get is that like they hear like what went wrong on the Discovery. They called it a Bloom failure. And so that's like kind of hints towards it, but doesn't say specifically what it is. And Burnham is basically like, I'm not here to help you create a new weapon so you can kill more people. Like, that's not my thing. That's not what I'm doing. And this is where Lorca does the big reveal. Like, and I think specifically he's like, I'm not creating a new way to fight. I'm creating a new way to fly. And he kind of lays out what the spore drive is. And actually in this episode, I don't think we specifically find out the tardigrades connection to it. But like, obviously that thing is important for some reason, somehow. I
think we can go ahead and talk a little bit about like the stuff in the episode 4, like, you know, spoilers for a show that's old and like you should have been watching more
Right.
of it already anyway. We got notes on our feedback anyway from our survey to care less about spoilers. So, just for the sake of conversation, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's the spore. Do you want to explain like the mycelial network situation?
Yeah. So the mycelial network is, it's basically my understanding is that it's meant to be a similar idea to the fact that like there are these like underground networks that plants use to like quasi communicate with each other, and it's supposed to be like that but with mushrooms, and it's like not just like groundwork for living things, but it's like a fundamental piece of how the universe works. And that's like what Stamets was getting at when he was talking about like, for what we're talking about, like there is no distinction between physics and chemistry. And
Right.
the idea is that they've figured out a way to use the mycelial network to travel faster than warp. Like it faster than warp is a misnomer, because they're not actually, it's like, yeah, it's like
They're
a new dimension
teleporting.
of subspace. Yeah, it's essentially that, and they're doing it across this network of mushrooms, essentially.
Right.
And that's kind of all we know for a minute.
Yeah, and so I think that the way I understood it was basically like you were saying, mushrooms themselves have like those those networks, and they do run between trees and they run between all sorts of things. And there's some ideas about like, communication, chemical communication across those networks. And it's sort of like that for string theory, right? It's like if you were to take quantum string theory, but the strings are actually mushrooms or mycelia, like that's the universe that is supposedly, I guess, now canon for Star Trek, right? Because we have to all accept now that the base structure of Star Trek's universe is mushrooms, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And it's I think discrete subspace domain, which is, I mean, subspace itself I feel like it's a storytelling vehicle, a lot like the Universal Translator or the Heisenberg compensator and the transporter. Like, how do we overcome the Heisenberg principle? Well, there's a Heisenberg compensator, of course.
Obviously.
I feel like subspace is very much a plot thing like that is like it's like a thought terminating cliche, but for stories and not discourse.
I guess, and I should say, I don't know if the point is that the entire universe at a like quantum level is really just mushrooms, or if part of the fundamental structure of the universe is that there is a layer in that fundamental layer that is the mycelial layer, and that's what allows for like life in the universe. I think was a suggestion at one point, potentially, or something like that, maybe.
Yeah. But the main focus is that this is a network that exists. They have figured out how to use it to travel, and they need the tardigrade to be able to do that. And that's, I don't remember if it's in episode 4 that we find that out specifically, but it's like in the next couple of episodes, they talk about needing the tardigrade to interface with the computer so they can navigate the mycelial network. And that's why they need the tardigrade. And,
yeah, because they realize the tardigrade is not aggressive, and that's where they use that fear reflex trick, and they realize that it can communicate with the mushrooms because it like wanders into them and is having a good time, which I would too. I understand.
I as someone who has also communicated with mushrooms, I also had a great time.
Right, exactly. And so they realize that like there's a connection, there's a relationship. It's like the spice and the sandworms and whatnot. And so what they try to do is see if they can have, they also found technology on the original ship that was like, this is something that like plugs into the tardigrade, and that's what they were using to achieve what they were doing. So it must have been like they were using it to navigate the network, because it's another one of these like, the amount of calculations you'd need to go through the network, or, you would need a wing commander to make this happen. And so... no Pilgrim blood on this ship, obviously.
A+ callback. Well done.
Call sideways. I guess NASA's a different subspace universe from this one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, so they need Ripper to run things, but it harms Ripper, which leads to one of my favorite moments of all time, which is they're eventually gonna replace Ripper with Stamets by getting Stamets really, really high, and then Stamets becomes one of already a funny character, but then absolutely one of the funniest characters of all time because he's grumpy to mushroom stoner in like the span of an episode. It's super good.
Yeah, it's the best.
Yeah. I love this show so much. I love everything about this show.
And I just, it's hard for me to be mad at Ripper for this, but I will also say that, like, my God, I loved Commander Landry, and Ripper ends up killing her, sadly.
Yeah, and I was surprised that she got proper murdered so early on. It felt like a waste. It felt like this show kind of murdered off some people in weird ways, and I feel like after Next Generation, we should have learned the lesson on that one, but I guess not. Very similar in a lot of ways, if you think about that for a second.
It is, but I mean, I guess, the difference between the way TV was made before and now, like, I feel like we can argue the merits of that story decision, but I would say it was probably something the writers meant to do from the start as part of the story, as opposed to a character being like, you're not using my character very much, so I would rather not be on the show. You're going to have to kill me. Sorry.
Yeah. And she certainly earns it. Like, she certainly, works hard to be the baddie who gets murdered kind of thing. Yeah. So, and we also get like this interesting sequence where like Ripper is taking damage and then eventually curls up into like a fetal like hibernation state, which is a great reference, I think, to the fact that in theory tardigrades themselves are like somewhat indestructible, that they are capable of, living in the vacuum of space and whatnot. And partly it's because of this like ability to kind of go into hibernetic states in this way, I guess.
Yeah. And apparently to enter, to bring it back around to earlier conversation, apparently to enter the mycelial network, you have to spin the saucer section of your ship independently from the rest of the ship, do a couple of flips, and then you move very quickly downward. And that somehow puts you on the mycelial network, so you're not a fan of that process. I actually think it's super cool.
What the funniest part about it is that you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, don't complain, Aaron. It's just a little special effect. It's not like it's going to be a key plot point at any point in the show. It's not like they're going to make you think about this for a really long period of time. It's not just a metaphor. They really do spin the whole ship. I'm not kidding.
Yeah. There's two separate spins. There's the pizza cutter spin where just the saucer section of the ship spins, and actually not the entire saucer section. It's like the outside of the saucer section, independent from the part that holds it in the middle, like where the hinge or the pivot point on the pizza cutter, and then it flips on the like x-axis.
Are the people in the saucer just stabilized, or would you say like inertial dampeners or such that you can do a 180 like that and it doesn't murder everybody in the saucer? Or there nobody in the saucer? Or
for sure. Yeah, the inertial dampeners have to be the thing there because I mean, even
good old inertial dampeners.
My understanding is even accelerating to impulse speeds without inertial dampeners would be a thing that would just like smash people like bugs on the back of the bridge or whatever.
It's so fun. Like spinning the disc would have been one thing and I would have been like, but like the flippy flip is so funny. It's just so comical. It's fine. Whatever.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
I love everything about the show, including the flippy flip is so funny to me because it's the same show in which the Klingons are speaking in their native language with subtitles in like a vibe that like very much is almost Apocalypse Now kind of almost like level of seriousness. And then it's just like flippy flip, do some mushrooms. Let's get high and fight some Klingons.
I never engineering. I never quite thought of it on that level, but you're 100% right. That's fantastic.
It's a bit of a mood vibe switch thing. That's fine. I'm fine with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that pretty much covers the important plot points here. So I'm thinking it might be time.
All right. Shall we then grok it, Captain?
We shall.
So there's lots of things, obviously, that could have been discussed here, but instead of like all of the boring, when is it okay to use your science to murder people questions, I want to talk about the mushrooms some more, obviously.
Yes.
And I want to talk about panpsychism. And this is a way for us to really, like, again, we're using Trek to catch the captain up on a variety of, like, intro-y philosophical topics. And this is going to be a kind of roadmap for philosophy of mind options and a conversation about a particularly tricky problem in science, which is the concept of emergence. So let me ask you, I'm just curious, Callie, I like to find out what levels of like philosophy have reached what range of popular conception. And panpsychism has been having a bit of a sort of moment recently. Is that something that you're aware of? Have you heard that term? Has that shown up in any of your worlds or anything like that?
I had never heard the term before you used it, but when I read about it, it's a thing that like conceptually I have thought about and heard other people talk about, but I had never heard it named. And I didn't, I mean, it's one of those things that like, it entirely makes sense to me that it's like a discipline and an area of thinking, but I had never heard anyone actually talk about it that way before. And so the idea that it is a topic in itself, like worthy of like thorough examination, that specific bit of it was new to me.
And often you can see versions of it in spiritual, non-traditional spaces as well, into kind of all the way into kind of woo-wee territory. So the thing we're talking about here, broadly speaking, is going to once again be this kind of hard problem of consciousness. We talked about this some before with the AI stuff. Again, this idea is, why consciousness instead of not consciousness? Like, why do we feel, Callie? Why do we have these inner states of awareness? Or do we, is another part of this conversation.
And just to be specific about it, so the term panpsychism is like the thought that everything has a mind or a mind-like quality or something to that effect, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Consciousness is a feature of the universe at a atomic, some level, at some very basic level, right? Whatever your base level is, there's consciousness there, essentially. Which is weird. It's a weird position initially to take, right? Because sort of the baseline back and forth here goes like this. You and I seem conscious. The table doesn't seem conscious. You're telling me the atoms inside of the table seem conscious. What does that mean? That seems weird. There's clearly a difference between me and the table. What are we doing here? Why are we having this conversation? Right. So I'm going to back up and do the gritty prequel, right? So the gritty 2-episode prequel to this conversation is you have the problem of consciousness in that there's a objective world out there that seems studyable by science, but there's also these weird minds inside of us that don't seem directly observable by other entities. Why is that, and how is that? And there are a couple of different theories. So the main answers to sort of the relationship between mind and body, let's say the mind-body problem is another way to talk about this. I should say there are lots of sort of related problems within the hard problem. It basically just means, how do you explain consciousness on our basic modern understanding of science? And that includes things like, what is the nature of consciousness itself, right? What is the nature of physical bodies? And you get a bunch of different kinds of theories. So the list would be substance, either dualism, or you could have a substance monism. And so the difference there is going to be how many substances are there in our universe. You can have a view called illusionism, or panpsychism is on there. And then Nestorianism, which is the view that I personally hold to. And we can talk about that a little bit. But to get us sort of started on the basic, there's a way I think it's worth thinking about this sort of historically almost, right? The previous view is souls, basically, right? We're souls. We're inside of a person, inside of these bodies. We're separate from the bodies. The soul connects to the body in some interesting way somehow because God. And there literally is the view occasionalism that says, the way that the perfect soul connects with the imperfect body is God makes the connection every single time. Anyway, then you get Descartes, right? Descartes comes along and excuse me, produces this idea of substance dualism, or presents one version of it. There's other people who also put forward various versions of this, but he's sort of the most famous, and that's why it gets called Cartesian dualism. So Cartesian dualism says there's mental substances and physical substances. Okay, so there's the body and then there's the mind. They're separate substances, but they interact somehow. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Essentially very similar to the soul thing, but arguably the mind is separate from the soul on this view. Descartes goes into all sorts of weird places with all of this stuff. But the famous sort of idea that comes, at the foundation of this is the cogito, I think, therefore I am, which is the idea that I can't be wrong, that I'm experiencing mental states. And in its most basic form, I would say, is we can't be wrong that there is subjective experience happening. We can be wrong about, the creature experiencing it, everything around it, etc. But at least we know subjective states are occurring, which is weird in a physical universe. Okay.
Right.
Naturally, a lot of scientists then come along and say substance dualism is terrible. That's nonsense. You're essentially just describing a soul still, right? Like there is no separate mental substance out there in the universe. That's phlogiston, right? That's vitalism or something. All we have is like the mind and like the body or the brain, and the mind emerges from that. Right. So then you get this kind of modern scientific view. And this can work out a couple of different ways. One can be, a straight up kind of monism. So this is going to be there, it's an illusion that there are two different things here, actually. Some folks, like a guy named Barclay, believe that everything was mind. He said, we can't deny that there's mind, so everything has to be mind because body is weird and makes no sense. So it's
body
all
is
mind.
Weird and makes no sense.
Yeah.
So far, I'm on board.
Right. Mind is also weird and makes no sense, but
well, that's also fair.
Body weird makes no sense. So we're all just ideas in the mind of God is essentially where that line of thinking ends up. A modern version of this would be, look, all you ever experience are your, phenomenally interpreted states inside of your virtual reality brain, inside of your Cartesian theater. So you never know that there's actually a material substance out there or something like that. You just assume there is. You infer it, essentially. That's called idealism. Idealism, monism. The other monism is going to be materialism, which is one that a lot of people believe in today, which is there's just material, right? There's only materials arranged in such a way that they give the impression of consciousness in certain situations. And here, things can go a couple of different ways, right? You can be an illusionist, and you can say, our experience of phenomenal states is actually false. We don't actually have mental states internally. I think I've discussed before a little bit about why I think that's not a plausible position. I think the illusionists try to have it both ways when they talk about mental states and stuff in a way that I don't think is functional or consistent. Another way you can do this is you can go towards emergence. And this brings us to a complicated scientific concept. And there are lots of different versions that people have put forward for what we mean by emergence. But the basic idea would be, how do you get medium-sized dry goods like ourselves out of quantum goo, right? Or in this case, fungi, right? Like, how do you get from fungi to us?
Dry goo. Or medium-sized, God, what did you call it? Medium-sized dry substance. Dry goods.
Yeah, this is actually a reference. My Indian philosophy teacher in my master's program used that phrase. I think it may be in some way a reference to like Sanskrit or something, like in the Hindu texts and things. They'll talk about like the different levels of reality and things, and there's like essentially a version where they talk about the medium-sized dry good level of reality, which is us. Right. Us right here.
I love that.
Yeah. I usually, especially when I'm trying to explain to people that like, even if there is some amount of quantum indeterminacy, it does not impact us at our, medium-sized dry goods level. So we were talking about materialism, right? So you have, in a materialist world, you just have emergence, and there's just the one fundamental reality, which is strings or fungi or whatever. And then out of that, you get particles, and then they come together and they create mass and, stars, planets, etc. And then eventually things come together in a weird enough arrangement that consciousness emerges.
Right. And I would say, at least so far as the mainstream view, I think that's probably the Star Trek universe's position.
It's probably almost 90% of people's position who don't believe in souls. Yeah.
It's just eventually things get sufficiently complex that all of a sudden we can get depressed.
Right. And there's literally a theory of mind called complexity theory or something like that, which basically just says if you have a dense enough bundle of complex connections, you get consciousness. It just pops into being. Not a dominant theory at this point, obviously. I would say arguably, and I say unfortunately, I think the dominant theory amongst philosophers, and I don't know about scientists or not, but it's probably some form of illusionism. That they kind of reduce the problem down in this way, or you end up a Mysterian like me, or you have this resurgence of panpsychism because of primarily the problem of strong emergence. So what is strong emergence? There's a couple of ways to define it, but the easiest way is it's not weak emergence. And weak emergence is the thing we understand and can study pretty effectively, which is, if I look at my table and I know that it's mostly empty space, I can understand how the forces between the atoms are creating the illusion of solidity or something. So that substance, that property of solidity, I can't put my hand through it, right, is generated by interactions on the lower level that I'm not directly experiencing. I'm experiencing the higher levels, property essentially, right? But the higher level property is not magic. It's not anything above and beyond just those forces pulling on each other kind of thing, right? Weak emergence is the thing that science is really, really good at studying a lot of the times. That doesn't make it not weird. We still don't actually know. Emergence is still kind of a vague term and ill-defined to some extent. It's sort of a we're dealing with it, but we don't really understand it kind of vibe.
And it's let me restate this back to you to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. So the idea of weak emergence is that we can understand physics well enough to know that once we do enough physics, we eventually get a table, and that process makes sense. So we understand physics and we understand how a table can emerge from physics, but we don't understand how anxiety comes from physics or
from monkey brain. Right.
Yeah.
How do you get from monkey brain to anxiety brain? And one thing that often is associated with issues of emergence is predictability based on understandings of the lower level of the system. So the idea would be, while not in practice because of the amount of computation necessary, in principle, if you understand the fundamental laws and you understand the fundamental particles properly, you could predict the behavior of every emergent property that comes from them, every emergent entity that comes from those properties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? We don't do that because it's way too hard. So what we get is heuristics for assessing different levels of reality, right? And it's, and these days science will just basically say, look, it's useful, whether or not it's true, it's useful to talk about the level of medium-sized dry goods as its own level and not try to understand it purely via the mushrooms, the mushrooms might help, but they're not going to explain a lot of behaviors at the medium-sized dry goods level because those are emergent behaviors. The most famous sort of paper about this, I would say, would be Daniel Dennett's paper about it, The Intentional Stance. And what he basically says is there's a physical stance for engaging with the world, which is I assess something as a physical object. A rock will act in certain ways. It'll have certain mass and et cetera, et cetera. It'll hurt people if I hit them with it, et cetera. Then there's a design level, which is I build a keyboard. I know it's going to do the things that I want it to do because I designed it to act in those kinds of ways, right? And then there's the intentional stance. That's entities where we are better off computationally if we just treat it like a conscious being, right? It's just a thing that's thinking, okay? And Dennett is one of the main proponents of illusionism, and he would basically say, look, none of us are conscious in the way that you think you are, but we treat you as a conscious being because it's functional and useful to do so, to interpret you as having these inner states of awareness, experiencing these things in the kind of way, because that is how you behave, and it's et cetera, et cetera. The problem So yeah, right, so you get the idea of weak emergence, right? I can predict things in theory, at least. I can, everything reduces down. There's a reducibility, feature. Strong emergence is some version of a property that doesn't reduce down, or is not fully explicable or fully predictable, or something along those lines from the lower level, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And
absolutely.
you can assume who our main candidate here is going to be consciousness, right?
Right.
And the hard problem essentially is really important because strong emergence is a problem for consciousness, arguably, in a way that it is not a problem for life, which is the next closest candidate for strong emergence. Right? They're both weird, but subjectivity is weirder than life. Life is just, externalizing entropy in a way that is not fundamentally different from robots or something like that, right? That's a solvable problem in a sense. The strong emergence problem is, why do we go from enough amount of objective things, objects piled together, to a subjective experience?
Right.
And if it isn't reducible down to the non-physical or down to the physical, that's a problem, because we don't see strong emergence anywhere else in the world. And that would be a very weird, almost supernatural kind of thing, right? It seems very contrary to our understanding of the laws of nature. So either our understanding of the laws of nature is just deeply, deeply wrong, or this is a big problem about any view like this, right? Now, the illusionists are going to say there's no problem because it's just weak emergence. The mental states are not doing anything special above and beyond the physical states. Right. One version of this is something called epiphenomenalism, which would say we have mental states, but they don't do anything causally at all, which is to say, we have the illusion that we're acting based on our mental states, but we're really just watching fireworks in our head while our body does all the business kind of stuff. It's not clear to me exactly what the illusionists believe on this front. I think they, again, equivocate to some degree. They would say they don't believe in a philosophical zombie, like someone who's just empty inside all the way. They actually, when they're pressed, I think will argue that mental states aren't special in the way we think they are, but they are still there, and we are still experiencing them, sort of, but not really. They go back, they go back and forth on whether the Cartesian theater exists. I think they are, anyway. So that's one option. The other one, again, is the panpsychism, which is very much along the lines of actually everything we know about science is wrong, which is where we get to our friend Stamets and his fungi, and actually, at the basic level, it's all just getting high. Panpsychists will say, look at, all the way down consciousness, right? There is no point at the evolutionary or non-evolutionary spectrum level where consciousness disappears from the world. And they will even say, look, it's a misunderstanding to think that the rock has a consciousness like ours, but the electrons within the rock have some kind of consciousness.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was gonna ask, is it a thing where they're talking about biology versus rocks, or the tension arm that's holding my camera or whatever?
Yep, all of it. It's all at the atomic level or the fundamental level, the string level, the fungi level. It's conscious. Right. And this is why I wanted to tie this into the show, is because I love the moment where the tardigrade wades into the mushrooms and they realize that it's communicating with them. I don't think we get a clear picture necessarily over the course of this show exactly how conscious the fungal network itself is. But arguably, we have reason to think that it has a kind of consciousness, potentially.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
For sure.
I think we can argue that it seems to act intentionally and sometimes manifests things that act very intentionally. Again, much like the Tao, right? Things arise out of it. But that, arguably, when you're talking about consciousness, if we're just talking about at the illusionistic level, it's just, behavioral stimulus, reaction, communication, then both the tardigrade and the fungi appear to be conscious entities in this kind of sense.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is too simplistic a thought, but the more we talk about these things, I end up thinking about kids movies where like the kids, I mean, Toy Story is one, but not the only one, where it's like, you know, the toys are alive and have a consciousness. The only reason the adults don't see it is because they don't want to, because they're not paying attention, because they don't care enough, right?
Right.
And so like, is that... I mean, I'm sure that doesn't like fully tease out the nuance of it, but like, is that the general idea that like that some form of that idea is true and that we either don't have the ability to notice it or we're just not paying enough attention to notice it? Like, is it kind of that thought line?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is where I think we could divide the world into philosophical panpsychism and, let's say, you know, supernatural or superstitious or woo panpsychism or something like that, right? So panpsychism is going to be very popular amongst people who want to say that the secret is true, for example, because it's a very useful way to explain the connections between quantum and consciousness, and it's everywhere, and so I can attract things to me, and, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, it can explain psychic stuff, obviously, right? Like... There's a lot to do in that space, let's say, for individuals who would be so motivated, right?
Right.
Philosophical panpsychism, though I will say some of its advocates, I would argue, are coming from religious places and like are motivated by that to some extent, is going to try to take a narrower claim and just say, look, strong emergence doesn't make any sense. And illusionism doesn't make any sense. So we've got to have no emergence, right? Instead, we avoid the problem of emergence by saying it's consciousness all the way, you know, there's consciousness at every level, so it doesn't radically come into existence at some point. Now, that has lots of problems. But before I dive into those,
I can...
right.
Yeah.
But you're feeling like you get the idea, right? It's a very...
Oh, yeah.
You know, and the first problem to me is that I would say initially it is very much a philosophical solution to a philosophical problem in a kind of sense, you know? Like, it's saying, well, this seems logically impossible, so this other thing, no matter how weird, must be logically the case, which is sometimes a correct inference and sometimes not. And in this case, I think it raises a lot of concerns because it's not clear what this actually means in the real world or how it's being applied, right? It's one thing to say on paper this logically follows, but then to say, well, what does this actually mean gets very confusing very quickly.
Yeah, I had that thought exactly. Because and I mean that's the other question is, and I mean I know like we're talking about philosophy, so the idea isn't always can we measure and test it, but I wonder even if there's like a way that we might be able to imagine but not implement, like is that a thing that's even possible to say that we found like a definitive answer to that?
Okay, good, right. So the first problem is what do we do with
this? Your face looks, the way your face your face changes when I ask a question like that, that's like, oh, I did a good job. I asked a good question.
No, I mean like this is what I like about it is that I think if we're having these conversations properly, a non-philosophically trained person can still get a sense of like, this doesn't seem right for X reason.
Right.
You know, and I think you're on the right track of like asking, what do you mean by this, right? Like, again, the best thing you can ever do with a philosopher is just be willing to say, I don't understand what you just said. Could you explain those words a little bit more? Right. Mostly because they love doing it, but also because like...
Right.
It's the right thing to do because the question again here is, what do we mean by conscious? And now you've introduced something else, which is consciousness-like states, right? Or properties.
Right. Because it's like a lot of things that we can say maybe are just philosophical exercises that are fun thought experiments. Like this, I think, has real serious implications for how we navigate the universe, right?
Yeah. If you take this view very seriously, I think there's a kind of an ethical proliferation problem that I haven't heard a great answer to yet. But let me, so the first question, of course, is going to be, are you literally saying electrons have an internal mental world comparable to ours, right? And the panpsychists are going to say no. For the most part, For the most part, they say, we're not claiming that it is conscious in the way that we are conscious. We are claiming that consciousness is one part of one property of the fundamental states of the universe or something, right? Like spin or something for quarks or whatever, right? But then, like I said, now we have a question of, we didn't even understand the first consciousness, the one we literally directly experience ourselves, maybe. Maybe we think we might be experiencing it, right? Directly. I, again, should also be in quotes, right? Like, nothing about any of this is direct, obviously, an hour in. But now we have this like electron consciousness, okay? And fine, they're not saying that, your question about the Toy Story, right? They're not saying that the toys are conscious, okay? They're not saying that my laptop is conscious or my table is conscious. They're saying its atoms have conscious-like features or something that explain why, if those atoms were arranged brain-wise, my mind pops out of it. But the problem is we don't know anything about electron consciousness, and we can't study it, like you pointed out, any more than we can study our own consciousness, which we're actually directly fucking experiencing. Excuse me.
Right. Well, and that's, I mean, I think it is, I mean, it's an interesting thing to consider because, I mean, I think most people would acknowledge that it's not a binary thing, right? Because like we can all acknowledge that like we make jokes about dogs being our kids, but in all seriousness, I think it's very reasonable to believe that a dog has some sort of internal, like emotional and psychological life. As different as it might look from our own, there is some similarity there. And like, we know that about a lot of other animals. And so like, as we like move down and down or the ladder, like, well, right, of course,
Well, and I'll go you one further, and here we're going to pancake back into the dark universe for a second. It was not always the case that human beings believed that animals are conscious. Some still don't, first of all. But one of the main proponents of they're not conscious is our friend Descartes from earlier in the show, who believed that they were just thinking machines or just functioning machines, essentially, right? They had no inner, mental states, which was a dominant view for a long time, which, as you would imagine, leads to more animal abuse. So, for example, as I learned about in my, I often tell this story because I think it's important to understand how philosophy impacts the world. Up until the 70s, it was standard practice, and I apologize, trigger warning for people who love dogs. It was standard practice when you were training veterinarians to do live deaths, essentially, where you would have a dog, you'd bring in a dog and you would, to show them what it looks like when an animal dies and how bleeding out works, they would bring one in and they would puncture it and let it die. And that was the process.
Wow.
Things like live vivisections. These were common practices up until way more recently than we would like to think. I got to study with some of the philosophers who helped, cause these things to slowly become illegal because of, animal rights.
Wonderful.
But it involves having to convince people that like, no, this creature is not just screaming in pain because it's pretending. It actually is feeling pain.
Right.
But then once you accept that, you do have a problem of like, where does consciousness stop in the evolutionary tree? Do you think it goes all the way down to the protozoas, or, is it somewhere, let's say the small squishy goods, right? So somewhere around fish, right?
Right.
There's debates about whether fish feel pain, for example. There are some animal rights advocates who will say it's okay to eat, bivalves, right?
Well, right, that's
my
what I was
mollusk
going to say.
Friends,
That's why I think obviously there are vegans who like eschew all animal products to the extent that it's possible, but a lot of people are like I'm vegan or like vegetarian, but like I'm okay eating fish, and I think that's the reasoning. I don't know enough to have a super strong opinion about it myself, but I know that's like that's a pretty common popular conception.
Right, and you could even make an argument between like, again, it's probably not okay to eat our friend Paul, but his friend the mollusk, right? Like the mussels, they're probably okay. But again, we can't test for it, so we don't know. But going back to our friend Panpsychism, it doesn't help us really much at all to say, well, it actually just goes all the way down, but it's not like the kind of consciousness we have. Because then you still have what they just have instead of emergence, what's called the problem of combination, which is to say, why and how does the right arrangement of electron consciousness bring about our kind of consciousness? Because it does seem still to be the case that like our consciousness is a very weird, very localized phenomenon. It's just us, as far as we know, just the creatures on this planet, and not even all of them, just some of them maybe. So like, why did that happen? And like, you know, it regenerates a hard problem essentially, right? Because we still have to understand how that combination comes together and creates us, but it doesn't do that for rocks.
Right. And this is like, I'm sure this is a discussion that happens in places where I maybe don't see it, but that's a thing that I think about a lot is when people are having that question, it almost always seems to boil down to like, the degree to which a thing interacts with the world in the most human-like way means that the most degree of consciousness is imparted to that being, right? Which is like, it's very easy to see why you get there, but I mean, we really like need to consider the fact that that's probably not the best thing to, I mean, I don't know that we have something better because like what else would we look for? Like, because that's the only experience that we know to test for that we would recognize, right? Like, I don't know that we have enough information to train ourselves to recognize it in a different way, but
that is the essence of speciesism, right? That's the problem is we are always measuring with a human yardstick, right? So we're always looking for central nervous systems, which I loved, you know, the things, because it's like they're like, oh God, a central nervous system, no thank you.
Right. But that's gross. I don't like that.
But like, that's our go-to thing to look for at this point, essentially, right? That's the first thing you're going to check for. Does it have enough neurons that I might think that they're firing in a conscious kind of way, which is still a kind of unofficial complexity theory. We haven't committed to it openly, but like, yeah. And I, you know, dear sweet Bernie Rollins, who spent his entire life helping animals not be tortured quite as much. I tortured him in his class by being like, how do we really know the plants don't have some kind of consciousness? And that's what the mycelial folks do. And it's, it's hard because it's like, well, they're communicating. How do we know that they're only communicating on a substrate level and not on a, expanded consciousness kind of level or something, right? And of course, the fact that we get high off them doesn't help our confusion about the issue, right?
And so then, of course, what we learn is that it's only possible to eat ethically once you invent replicators.
Right, as long as the replicators. Well, I mean, this is also so this gets us to the problem of what I would say is moral proliferation, right? Which I think you've been referencing here, which is a lot of our morality ties directly to our consciousness, right? The reason I can smash a table in a way I can't smash you without your consent, right, would be that you're conscious and it's not, right? Nobody cares when I destroy non-conscious things unless they're really important to someone who is conscious, generally speaking. So, if we're going to say every atom is conscious, are we going to say every atom has moral value, right?
Right.
And again, they say it's not our kind of consciousness. So they might want to say, well, therefore it doesn't have the same kind of moral value. But that seems like a really weird, again, you're just, you've done something that works on paper, but is unconnected to anything that we actually think about when we think about consciousness. That's a problem, right? It's not doing any labor at that point.
Yeah. And it feels like it opens up an actual slippery slope to like really uncomfortable places.
Sure. Because if we're going to say, well, look, the atom consciousness is worth 1/1000th, then we're back to the conversation of like, how much is the animal consciousness worth?
Whereas, and how much quote unquote normal human consciousness does a human body have to have before we value that entity as its own person.
Right. And this is something that the utilitarians in particular are absolutely not on board for, because they want to just be like, no, everybody's suffering counts the same, right? If you're a being that can suffer, that's all that matters. It's not, can you suffer times 3 or something like that, right? You don't have, when you get into, like the elitist debates about like higher and lower values or pleasures or something like that, that's another one where people get worried about that slippery slope, or, we would say not slippery slope, but like that's the fallacy version of the like, reductio ad absurdum, right? What you end up with is only entities that can experience the higher pleasures, right, are real or matter the most, right? We essentially become utility monsters in comparison to the animals who can't experience as much pleasure, right?
Right.
Mill literally talks about like a pig versus a human, and we can know that the human has a better life than the pig because we know what it's like to be, the human with all this consciousness and stuff. It's a very bad argument.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Before we move on, you said you called yourself a Mysterian. Is that the word that you used? We haven't discussed that yet. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, and this is, once again, following my patron Saint Nagel. 9 times out of 10, I'm just cribbing from Nagel, if I'm being honest. We stand on the shoulders of Nagel. He also actually was sympathetic to panpsychism. He has a really good chapter in his book, Mortal Questions, which is the same book that has Moral Luck in it, which is the chapter that screwed me up for life. It's also got What It's Like to Be a Bat, the one that we talked about previously. It's one, panpsychism, and he talks about the problem of emergence, and he uses the term slightly differently than other scientists, but we're not going to get into the nuances of that. But some folks will also say that Nagel is sort of one of the most famous Mysterians in general, because he sort of, in that book, emphasizes that he doesn't have answers to a lot of these questions and thinks that they are important questions, but that he trusts the questions more than the answers, essentially. So the sort of formalized version of this would be to say, I think the hard problem is real. I think consciousness is real. I think there is a solution to the problem because we're here. I don't think we have any idea what it is. And I'm not even sure we're moving in the right direction necessarily. So that's the Mysterian position, is to say, it's a mystery, right? George Carlin style. I don't know, it's a mystery. But to be persistent in that, to be comfortable with saying it's better to say that we don't know than to accept some fake version of consciousness as our definition so that we can make all of this work for us right here and now, kind of thing. It's a resistance to adopting one of the other positions, essentially.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. And obviously I don't have the training that you do, but at least intuitively, I feel like that's what feels the most correct to me too. Because all of those other questions are so difficult. I feel like we have to lean really hard into the fact that we can have ideas, but let's be careful about what we say we know.
Yeah, and so, people who are going to be critical of the Mysterians, to turn against myself now, first of all, they're going to say, well, that's not helpful, right? But I would argue, science is like this a lot of the time. We're like, look, we know that quantum works because math. We don't know why or how, but math.
Yeah, unhelpful and true are not opposites. They're not mutually
right. If anything, they probably go together in my experience. Right. More often than not. They will also, the more sophisticated argument would be, we have mapped the entire conceptual landscape, right? You could argue that our version of dualism or our version of panpsychism isn't quite perfect, but look, one of these things has to be the case. It's either monism or dualism or illusionism, or, these are all the logical possibilities.
We've definitively figured out what the possible answers are. We just don't know which particular one is the right one.
Right. So the only mystery is which is the right one in that kind of way. That could be kind of you could think that as a weak Mysterian position or something like that. Whereas a strong Mysterian position would be, we're never going to know. And I don't necessarily believe that. I do believe that we're never going to have the machine where we can really directly experience someone else's subjective consciousness and study it the way that we do objective reality. But I think the answer is going to be something energy. And in that way, I'm fine with the fungi, right? If it really turned out to be fungi at the fundamental level, that would be, I expect a weird answer that involves energy. And and you can argue that that's a version of monism or something like that, or whatever. I don't so much care as I want us to understand that I don't think we have an easy, clear solution to this right now. And simply saying, mind emerges from brain or electrons or consciousness, right? These may map out potential options, but they don't seem to work, which makes me wonder, can any version of them work in this way, right? Or is it just going to be the case that all of these have fatal flaws, so necessarily we're missing an option here somehow? So yeah, and again, I'm not a good enough philosopher to know the answer. I am just a good enough philosopher to don't think we have the answer. That's as far as I get.
That's fair. Well, and I think because along with that, there has to be what we would refer more to as like the hard science side of things. Like we realize that there's just such a huge gulf in our knowledge that like there could be an entire segment of reality, like all of the domains of subspace, for example, that like somehow fit into what we know without changing it. But it's like, it's like having a super accurate like quarter of a painting, like, and just not being able to figure out what the rest of it looks like.
Yeah, and I was actually just listening to Sean Carroll's book about everything, and he talks about how like we are pretty confident that we understand the fundamental quantum rules, again, because math. We don't understand how or why or anything much beyond that, but like we're pretty sure that we've got like that sort of stuff mostly down, and it would be really surprising if like those got thoroughly kind of upended in this kind of way. As you can imagine, most scientists don't love the revival of panpsychism in philosophy because they're like, for all the reasons you've talked about, what does this mean? How is this testable? Like, this feels like a God of the gaps kind of situation in many ways, especially when, we don't have any information from the panpsychists about like what is electron consciousness, how is it different from spin, how would we ever potentially test it. So it does seem like a purely on paper argument in this kind of way, and because it doesn't cash out effectively on an ethical level or anything like that, going to the semantics game part of this, where it's like, you can call anything you want consciousness, but some things it's more useful if you call them consciousness or not, right? There's no utility, as far as I can tell, that's gained in the panpsychist position. It doesn't advance any understanding in a kind of way that's functional or applicable or something like that, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that would be where I would say, look, I don't think it's useful for us to call this whatever property of the universe that allows consciousness to exist, consciousness itself, right? I think it'd be better to just call it spin or whatever, and like keep consciousness for the thing that you and I are maybe experiencing.
I feel like for the rest of my life, every time I mention being conscious, I'm just going to be like, I think. Maybe, possibly.
Pretty sure. That's philosophy for you, right? It's just caveats all the way down. And then it's fungi at the bottom level. Somehow, even though that's logically inconsistent. Yeah.
And you know what? Like, that's a universe I can live with, I think.
Right. I mean, yeah. What I would say is, look, consciousness is weird, and I believe that the fundamental nature of the universe is also going to be weird. That part I agree with, right? It can't be normal because I don't think we get this amount of weirdness out of normal. So I do think it's going to be some kind of weird. We just don't know exactly what kind yet.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. And like, we should also be clear, consciousness and life are not, the same thing. So it could be the case that there could be consciousness at the fundamental level, but it's not fungus or anything like that, right? It's just... something, right? Somethingness. There's a view called property dualism, which is probably closer to where a lot of us, I think, end up, which is like there's just, substance, and mostly we think of it as a physical substance, though it may not be. It may just be a substance in a true, featureless sense. And then there are physical properties and mental properties or something like that, right? So all these properties are emerging out of the lower level, which is not strictly speaking physical, it's pre-physical or something like that. And then we have tables, but we also have minds. But you still have a problem, obviously, of emergence there, right? Why are mental states emerging in some places and physical states emerging in others? We haven't gotten into it. We're pretty much getting to the end of time here, but like another layer on top of all of this are the kind of questions of what is the purpose or function of subjective mental states? Like, are they something that actually helps us survive, or are they useless? Right? Or are they side effects, essentially, right, of a system that helps us survive?
Interesting. And I know we're running short on time, but walk me through that real quick, because it feels very self-evident to me what the advantage of consciousness would be. But if that's a debate, it's like maybe I'm wrong for thinking it's that self-evident.
True for most people. I think most people would assume that it's advantageous because, the standard story goes, consciousness emerges because it allows one to more effectively engage with one's environment in a flexible kind of way, it seems like, right? So without consciousness, you've just got stimulus response, let's say.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, and again, some people will argue that stimulus response is itself a basic kind of consciousness, but a lot of other people think, you know, you can have unconscious stimulus response and conscious stimulus response. And the idea would be that conscious stimulus response is better at certain tasks than the unconscious version. If you think about, you know, our current state of AI, for example, they're not as flexible as us. So some people have argued that consciousness would make an entity that can easily, you know, jump from one kind of game to another and understand that they're both games and they both have rules. And, you know, if you learn checkers, you can learn chess in the way that a chess computer just gets murdered by anyone at checkers kind of thing. Right. But not all consciousness seems to have that kind of flexibility necessarily. A lot of kinds of consciousness still seem sort of very inflexible in this kind of way. If you're just going to say that consciousness is just flexibility, okay. I would actually argue that flexibility is the sign of healthy consciousness, but that's like a Gestalt therapy position. But you know, the basic idea is you're better able to quickly interpret and understand your environment. But then the question is that actually the case? Or would you actually be better able to quickly react to your environment if you weren't conscious? Because think of all of the times when consciousness screws you over when you're trying to act quickly, right?
Right.
So what you end up getting is, I think the dominant view is thinking fast and slow is the book or the term where like you have fast consciousness, which is unconscious reactions, and then you have slow consciousness, which is deliberative consciousness, and that is useful for things like understanding causality, which allows me to then make tools, you know. So you would see the emergence of consciousness with entities that are sophisticated enough in their, you know, level of GUI digits plus whatever to do something with that consciousness, right? To be able to like benefit from thinking slowly at some point. We as, you know, humans arguably are majority still thinking fast, right? So if you want to think of consciousness as thinking slow consciousness, we are not doing it a lot, right? We are not very conscious beings in that sense, right? We are mostly thinking fast beings who, if we're very lucky, think slow sometimes. But also notice, this doesn't seem to really track our understanding of phenomenal consciousness. When you feel pain, that's not thinking slow. You know what I mean? That's not the kind of consciousness that we are actually thinking of as being useful consciousness. You know, pain is a very fast reaction. So why do we feel pain? Why don't we just react without the actual pain part is the question.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So why do we have conscious thinking fast? Even if we can understand the value of consciously thinking slow, why do I have to feel the pain, God? Why?
I mean, I guess my first reaction would be that, like, you know, evolution is an ongoing process, and maybe at some point, millions of years in the future, that will be a thing.
Right. And that's basically literally the thesis of Blind Sight. I know you weren't here when we did that book, but like, it's essentially, you know, there are what are called, sort of localized maximums within evolution, right? Something is an advantage. It's like the top of a hill, and you think you're at the top of an evolutionary ladder, but you don't see the giant mountain over there because you're stuck on this little hill, right?
Right, yeah.
AI training gets stuck in this all the time, where it gets stuck in a like local optimization, but loses the game over and over again because it's running in circles, right? Yeah. So, you know, essentially the idea would be consciousness itself is like, you know, a localized maximum, but unconsciousness actually has a much higher ceiling to it. And that what you want is to be an unconscious being that is very, you know, good at analytic reasoning, but on an unconscious level. And the illusionist would basically say that's kind of what we are, right? We really are just unconscious beings who pretend that we are conscious or think that we are conscious, but we're really just doing this stuff at a very basic kind of level all the time.
That makes sense.
It doesn't. None of this makes any sense. This is all very, very silly.
That's fair.
It's all silly. And that's what I love about consciousness stuff, is because it makes a joke of science in this kind of way, in a way that like is good, because we shouldn't take science too seriously, even though it is really, really important, right? That doesn't give us liberty to run wild on like the other side of things. But like, I think it's really a valuable corrective to scientism to understand just how hard the hard problem remains in this way, and how, you know, both philosophers and scientists are just like, we really have very little here, right? We can nudge some of the causal relationships a little bit, but we don't understand why almost any of this is happening.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right. And you could imagine, obviously, people are going to then say, and because God, right? God wanted us to be conscious.
Of course.
Which is the end of every philosophical question, which is why you should be a Mysterian, because otherwise you'll end up with them.
If you're an atheist and you like being that way.
I do worry. I mean, I do see atheists who get pulled into panpsychism who I think end up in a kind of God, theistic-y place. In a,
Yeah.
And there is like the Spinozan God, which is the substance God, which is the non-thinking, non-conscious God, is again, something that I think is interesting and worth talking about and discussing. But if you start to claim that it's conscious, even at atomic level, then we have problems again, right? So anyway, I think we're probably way at time here, but hopefully you now understand the landscape of things that we don't understand.
I do. I have a much better understanding of my own shortcomings as a person in the way that I understand the universe. Thank you.
Yeah. Are you really conscious, or are you just a brain telling itself it's conscious?
Yes.
So I guess with that, maybe we should do the things we have to do every week, or every other week, I say, which is, I guess, first preview our next conversation. We are going to watch the movie Lawnmower Man. We are going to have a very special guest for this one that I'm excited about. Fans of ETV will remember this person as one of the best episodes of Embrace the Void, but they're going to come over here and talk to us about Lawnmower Man and, let's say, its representation of disabled individuals. We'll call that a jumping off point and go from there, right?
Yeah.
It's
gonna be.
It's a fun one. Yeah. I'm really excited. This is one of those movies where I was like, I watched this as a kid and wondered for a while if I'd made it up. And I'm glad that I'm going to now inflict it on some other people and listen to them try to cope with this as an adult. Look forward to that.
And so with that, let's thank some of the folks that make this all possible. We have our strong AI patrons that I am not funny enough to make a cool joke about like Aaron does. I apologize, friends. Randall Nelson Peterman, Corey Ebert, and I'm going to be high as a kite by then. Big Easy Blasphemy, give to modestneeds.org, then visit deepfakestop.com. Dude, Jesta, a wise Zin once said, you can't be neutral in a moving train. Jesse Rabinowitz and Brendan Goodman, Alex Arnett, and are definitely not a clone, maybe a tardigrade patrons, Alex Benishek, and yelling at podcasters is para-antisocial. Thank you very much, friends.
We really should change that level to tardigrade. I mean, clearly this was the whole basis of the Fungi Network level 2 patrons, obviously. But yes, tardigrade level patrons for sure. So I think with that, it's time for us to head down to the old spore room and see if we can all become one. So those of you looking to take a heroic dose with us, why don't you head on over to patreon.com/0G. And for everyone else, thank you so much for listening. It's been a lot of fun. Captain?
Let's go talk about the other kind of spinny maneuver.
Don't look up the pancake in Urban Dictionary. That will go poorly for you.
Well, of course, I'm going to go do that right now.
I don't know what it is, but Rule 34 tells me that it's there and it's bad. So I can make that joke comfortably and know that in the possible universe where you go and look, you're going to find it.
Thanks again to our listener units and patron units. Your support makes our internet broadcast possible. If you want to hear more from us, check out our other internet broadcasts, Queersplaining and Embrace the Void, as well as our wonderful editor Louisa Lyons Filmed Live Musicals podcast. Leave them all 5-star ratings and reviews on your podcast application. You can follow us on Twitter at 0gphilosophy or email us at philosophersinspace@gmail.com. If you want to support the show and get even more juicy sci-fi hot takes, consider joining the crew over at patreon.com/0G. Just $2 a month gets you early access to episodes and after dark content. Until next time, friends, stay gooey.